Welcome back to part 4 of ranking the Colorado 14ers. We're jumping into my third season of climbing back in 2020, and this one actually started out with some winter climbs. So snowshoed up Mount Evans, now known as Mount Blue Sky. So given that this is a really popular 14er right in the Front Range and there is a paved road up to the summit similar to Pikes Peak, I was looking for different route options to make this one a little bit more interesting. So I decided to snowshoe up the west side of the peak from Guanella Pass in the winter. And it went really well. I had pretty good snow conditions, climbed up the west gully, and made my way across the ridge to a very windy and cold summit without many people around. Different than the summer for sure. It was really neat to get up on top of this summit in the middle of the winter, and definitely sort of set the tone for a lot of upcoming snowshoe trips that I would be going on. It's a pretty well-loved mountain that you can see from Denver, and there's a couple different routes on it, including some pretty short and sweet couloirs that you can access right from Summit Lake where the road goes to, and I'll put Mount Blue Sky in the C tier. A few weeks after, I went over to La Plata and also snowshoed up that for a winter climb. Really enjoyed this one. It was definitely a step up from the Mount Evans winter route. La Plata actually has a different winter variation of the standard route that takes you up onto the ridge earlier and avoids some avalanche terrain that could be found on the regular summer trail. So it was just a really long, snowy ridge climb all the way up to the top. And again, after having climbed the last couple seasons really in that late summer window, it was just super exciting to see the peaks in snow and climb up there in snowshoes in the middle of the winter. And it was a pretty exciting and eye-opening couple of trips, these ones. La Plata also has a really long Class 3 ridgeline called the Ellingwood Ridge, which I haven't been up, but it seems to be one of the more sustained and complicated ridges on any of the 14ers. La Plata flies under the radar a little bit, but it is a pretty cool peak. I'll put it in B tier. So at this point, working my way through the list, I had saved a couple of really interesting peaks that I was really excited to climb, and then also had a number of peaks that I just kind of had left over and was not quite as excited about. A lot of those being the collegiate peaks of the Saguache Range. They don't offer quite as many options for ridgelines or traverses or scrambles, but they are connected famously by the Nolan's 14 line, which links up the 14ers of the Saguache and one super intense push. Similar to many of the other Saguache 14ers, Mount Antero definitely falls into the big rounded Class 2 talus pile category. And there is also a 4x4 road that leads nearly all the way to the summit, and that road definitely gets a good amount of motorized travel. You'll hear about Antero having some rare minerals and gems up high, but that's not quite enough to redeem its other qualities. I'm going to put Antero down in the E tier. Mount Shavano is pretty similar to Mount Antero, just without a lot of the negative aspects of the dirt road and the motorized use. I really enjoyed going back to Shavano to climb and ski the Angel of Shavano, which is a great kind of introductory level ski mountaineering descent. But hiking up the standard trail for my first time up Shavano was just an interesting weather day. It was kind of a mid-spring snowstorm, and by the time I got up to the summit, it was mostly a whiteout condition, so that kept me from continuing over to Tabeguache, which is usually combined with Shavano, so I would have to go back for that later. I did enjoy the sort of mysterious atmosphere that the snow squall added to this peak. I'll put Shavano in C tier as well. Culebra Peak is a pretty interesting peak. It's the only one that's actually completely on private property and requires a paid and timed permit to be able to hike. The permitting process is not all that complicated, but it does make you a little bit more grateful for all of the public access that we do have to these other peaks in the state. The route itself is pretty easy. Turning off of the dirt road at a certain point to just kind of meander your way up the tundra and talus onto the ridge over to the broad summit. The peak is really far south in Colorado, pretty near to the New Mexico border, so the view is really unique. Culebra Peak is probably only worth visiting if you're trying to climb all the 14ers and need to check that box. There is a good amount of red tape and not the most unique climb on its own. I'll put Culebra with Antero in the E tier. Snowmass Mountain is one of the longer approaches on any single 14er. Most people are going to hike up the 8 miles to Snowmass Lake, camp out there. It is a permitted site in the middle of the Maroon Bells Snowmass Wilderness and one of the most stunning alpine lakes in the state. From the lake, it's a really cool route to get up over the boulder field onto the Snowmass itself, crossing that snow for a good ways, and then finally gaining the ridge. And then it's a really fun and kind of unexpected scramble from the top of the snowfield up to the summit. And the view is absolutely stunning up there. Really cool to have such a mixed route between the long approach, the campsite, the moderate snow climb, ridge scramble. Snowmass really has a lot to offer, and this was definitely one of my favorite trips of the year. I'll put Snowmass Mountain up in the A tier. Huron Peak is back in the Sawatch, and it's also known for having one of the best summit views, mostly due to its proximity to the 13ers, the Three Apostles. And those peaks are definitely some of the most interesting in the Sawatch range. But Huron itself is pretty standard 14er affair, just a nice, well-maintained trail that switchbacks its way up through the trees and then into the alpine up to the summit. I'll put Huron in the C tier. After being in that whiteout on the summit of Shavano, I had to go back to get Tabeguache, which is just next to Shavano, but I ended up climbing them both separately on 2 different occasions. So this kind of secondary route that I took up Tabeguache was not the most memorable. It did kind of get off trail for a bit, and then it's just a long, broad, talus-covered ridge up to the summit. So this is another one that's just kind of checking the box, but there's not really anything specifically negative about it either. I'll put Tabeguache in D tier. Continuing to work my way through the collegiate peaks, went over to Princeton. And Mount Princeton has a dirt road that climbs quite high up the peak as well. But from there, what I really remember most about the hike was just the time of day getting up there with the golden sunshine really lighting up the whole peak. It's a Class 2 climber's trail up to the top, kind of traversing just below the ridge line and then switchbacking up the face. Finding the way down from the summit is a little bit tricky. The climber's trail isn't quite as easy to see. Mount Princeton is definitely another peak that looks really impressive from a distance, but the hiking route itself doesn't really live up to those expectations. I'll put Princeton in D tier also. Mount Yale has a couple different routes that are often climbed. I took a longer approach from the Colorado Trail up the East Ridge. It was a pretty scenic Class 2 climb, a little bit of route finding, but mostly just following a trail. And Mount Yale does stand out as a little bit more aesthetic than most of the other collegiate peaks are. Mount Yale can go in the C tier as well. So back in the first season when I had hiked up Mount Harvard, I did attempt the traverse over to Columbia, but actually got caught in a hailstorm and bailed off the ridge halfway through, which was definitely a learning experience and one that I thankfully have not made the mistake of repeating. So I came back for Mount Columbia this time around. And Mount Columbia, the trail had just been reconstructed by the Colorado 14ers initiative and really appreciated the good work that those folks did. On a lot of these more popular 14er routes, having a well-built trail is just absolutely essential and prevents erosion and, unnecessary degradation of the landscape in these fragile high alpine environments. Just followed that trail up through the talus, switchbacking up and looking back over toward Harvard from years before and the long traverse between, and remembering how silly it was that I thought that I'd be able to make it to Columbia before that storm came in. But Columbia is pretty standard. I'll put it in D tier also. So after ticking off those boxes in the Sawatch, I had my final 4, which were the peaks that I had been looking forward to the most this whole time. Little Bear Peak, true to its name, may sound benign, but it is not your friend. The standard route climbs up a particularly spooky section called the Hourglass, which is a narrow 4th-class gully where the rock quality is really solid and the climbing's pretty fun. But the problem is that above that is a huge bowl of loose rock that are just waiting to tumble down and funnel into that Hourglass gully as you're climbing up it. So the rockfall danger is really significant when climbing Little Bear Peak. especially when you have other climbers up ahead of you who could very easily but unintentionally kick rocks down on you. So to mitigate that, my friend and I actually climbed up Little Bear in the evening and summited around sunset. We were the only ones up there, and we just took care to climb really carefully and not send anything down on each other. So we got up to the summit around sunset and actually bivvied, spent the night up there, and then in the morning traversed across the ridge to Plata Peak. The Little Bear to Blanca traverse is the third of the 4 great 14er traverses, and it's just absolutely one of my favorite routes. It's a really high, narrow ridge, but the rock quality is quite trustworthy, certainly compared to the El Diente Wilson traverse. And we just had a blast working our way across that thing at sunrise, making our way over toward Plata Peak, and crossing those couple of really narrow sections of catwalk ridge lines, and summiting Blanca once again. It is just about as exposed and gnarly as any 14er ridgeline, and I thoroughly enjoyed that ridge traverse. Little Bear is definitely one of the gnarlier mountains in Colorado, and the ridge traverse over to Blanca is an absolute classic. So I'll put Little Bear in A tier. So that brings us to the final combination of 14ers, the Maroon Bells. Likely the most photographed and famous mountains in Colorado, and climbing these peaks was a huge motivation to even start climbing the 14ers in the first place. I wanted to work my way up to being able to do ridge lines like this and the one on Little Bear, and the Maroon Bells absolutely did not disappoint. Again, the Maroon Bells Wilderness is an absolutely stunning area. This was early October, so the aspen leaves were in full force. There is a permitted timed entry and shuttle system to get up to the Maroon Lake area, so I actually rode my bike in from Aspen and then got a permit to camp up at Crater Lake. Spent the night there and then got an early start to climb up the standard route on Maroon Peak, which is mostly on trail but a very steep climb. It gets a little more interesting once you gain the ridge and sort of wind your way along the ridge up to the summit. So getting up on top of Maroon Peak and then looking over to North Maroon is only a half a mile away, and the connecting ridge between them is the fourth of the 4 great 14er traverses, and it's the most technical of the 4. There are 3 pretty distinct cruxes on the route, each of which requires sequencing up a few 5th class climbing moves where you're using handholds just as much as footholds, but the rock in those sections is thankfully quite solid. And then in between the cruxes, you're navigating across the ridge, which is mostly just staying up on top of the ridge direct, and slowly picking your way across a lot of loose rock over toward the summit of North Maroon. The route down North Maroon is pretty circuitous, and you're kind of dropping gradually down a series of different broad gullies, including one small section of a 4th class down climb. Definitely keep an eye out for mountain goats and pay attention for cairns and route finding, because this route is definitely not as obvious as others. I really enjoyed traversing between the Maroon Bells. It was one of those routes that was very engaging and really requires you to stay in the present moment at all times and pay attention to every move you're making. Similar to Little Bear, I was glad to have saved it for as long as I did, and it really felt like a great final exam for climbing the 14ers. And again, just iconic Colorado mountains. I'll put the Maroon Bells in the S tier as well. So from my campsite at the Bells, I headed out the next morning up to Pyramid Peak, which would be my 14er finisher, and it was a great one to end on. I had an absolute blast climbing up this really steep, interesting route. You start down at the lake, climb up to tree line, and then cross this big, wide, boulder-filled amphitheater, climb up onto the ridge, and then there's a few interesting traverses where you're kind of stepping across gaps in the ridge. Later, climbing up a section of kind of light green colored rock that was really solid and fun to climb. And then getting up on that summit and looking back over at the Maroon Bells right across the way and the traverse between the two. It's just hard to believe that just the day before I'd been walking across that whole ridge line. Obviously super exciting to stand on the top of my final 14er And yeah, spending those last couple climbs in the Maroon Bells wilderness, it was just the perfect way to cap everything off. So Pyramid Peak is always going to have some special value to me, and call me sentimental, but I do think it's a really high quality climb and just as challenging, scenic, and rewarding as the Maroon Bells. So it's got to go in S tier too. So yeah, as the chart shows, this season was definitely kind of split between two different categories. You know, I was kind of just working on checking off some of those boxes of the Class 2 peaks in the Swatch that I had left behind until now, and then also climbing those really high quality peaks that I had been working my way up to the whole time. And getting up those just really blew me away time and time again. Between Snowmass, Little Bear, the Maroon Bells, and Pyramid were just some of the most fun trips that I've had. Overall, I think the Colorado 14ers really provide a great introduction to mountaineering in the Rockies. You can start out on a number of these easier peaks with Class 1 trails to the summit, work your way up through the looser Class 2 climbs, get into some Class 3 scrambles, and then build up to some pretty exposed and committing routes on some of the more challenging peaks. And for me, that was just the perfect introduction to Colorado, allowed me to travel all across the state and get a sense of each of the different mountain ranges, climb the highest peaks in them, and build up a really strong skill set as I went. But at the same time, the 14ers really only represent the tip of the iceberg for mountains in Colorado. There are over 10 times as many 13ers as there are 14ers in the state. And even before I had finished the 14ers, I was already working my way through climbing some of the high 13ers that make up the Colorado Centennials. Those are the highest 100 peaks in Colorado, which includes the 54 14ers and the 46 highest 13ers. And like many others before me, I definitely found switching over to the Centennial 13ers to be the perfect natural extension of the 14ers. There's less maintained trails, a lot more options for ridge traverses and link-ups of various peaks, plenty more non-standard off-trail routes and snow climbs to be found, and generally much fewer people climbing those peaks than the 14ers. So this tier list series will be continuing with the high 13ers of the Centennial Peaks, and also set things up for my planned completion of that list this year. So thanks for watching, and subscribe for more.